Ben Bowler of Unity Earth, and we are into day 6 of World Unity Week 2022 and day 6 of the 99 days of peace through unity. Today's special um, uh, foundation of life that we are honoring is the foundation of life of climate. And I'm really interested to see how our panelists today talk about how we're going to reestablish right relationship to this foundation of life. The foundations of life have come inspired by eco-governance, and we're very honored to have the originator of eco-governance here with us today, Dr. Shelley Ostroff. And Shelley is joined by Daniel Christian Wahl and Isabel Friend. So let me start just by welcoming you all to the panel today. Welcome to World Unity Week. We have. It's wonderful to have you all here. We have a video from our beloved Jyoti Ma, who is presencing the importance of sacred sites in all of these foundations of life and connecting them to the foundations of life. So I want to just begin with a very short video from Jyoti Ma.
Oh, Creator, I'm reaching up to you today because I know there's a lot of people talking about climate change when we truly know that at the root of it all, it has to do with the Mother Earth and her sacred territories, for they must be opened and activated again so she can breathe and move more freely to help us through this transformational moment we're in. And then the climate, it's talking to us. It's Mother Earth shouting out to us to listen to her instruction. Let us listen deeply. This is my prayer. This is my prayer. This is my prayer.
Let us listen deeply indeed. Let me tell you a little bit about our esteemed guest today. Shelley Ostroff, PhD, is a planetary activist, leadership consultant, social architect, mystic, and writer. She's the founder of Together in Creation, Codes for a Healthy Earth, 7 Days of Rest, and other initiatives dedicated to the healing and replenishment of the planet and all its inhabitants. Daniel Christian Wahl is one of the catalysts of the rising regeneration and the author of Designing Regenerative Cultures. He works as a consultant, educator, and activist with NGOs, businesses, governments, and global change agents. Daniel has a bunch of different degrees in biology, holistic science, and design. His work has influenced the emerging field of regenerative design. Great honor to have you with us today, Daniel. Isabel Friend is an international ambassador of water, public speaker and educator. As a student, servant, and steward of water, she seamlessly blends science and spirit into a comprehensive cosmology of water wisdom, spanning the practical insights of health, hydration, and biology to empowering tactics for watershed guardianship and ecological activism, to the esoteric and subtle insight of ancient indigenous water wisdom, to the heady scientific discoveries of cutting-edge water research. Isabel's offerings are as multifaceted as water itself. Wow. So again, let's dive straight in. We are establishing, how can we restore the right relationship with the foundation of life that is climate. And Shelley, I want you to begin by really explaining to us climate as a foundation of life, according to eco-governance, and how do we restore right relationship to it?
So first of all, thank you for this extraordinary opportunity to really create this week dedicated to restoring the right relationship with the foundations of life, which, as eco-governance articulates them, is earth, water, fire, air, climate, biodiversity, and the web of life. And so over the years, for many years now, I've been in deep communion, I would say, conversation with these foundations of life. It's a deep contemplation, dialogue, and I've learned so much from them. And it's like they've appeared to me in different ways as consciousnesses. And I think that at this time of humanity, as we're recognizing the limitations of our current ways of thinking, that we tend to locate consciousness in the minds of human beings, but now we're really understanding that consciousness is so much more, and that people are having interspecies communication, interdimensional communication. And I've had the good fortune, the privilege of really spending many, many hours talking with climate. And it's a very reflective space. It's a very deep place of reverence. And I never fail to be in awe of what climate has to reveal to me. So as we think about these 7 foundations of life, we tend to think of earth and water and fire, air. They're individuated in some ways. And climate for me is this meta consciousness. It's hard to limit her in any words, so I'm just going to give a few words and know that it isn't any of them, but it's this vast matrix, field of consciousness, an ancestral being, a womb-like field in which water, fire, air, and earth actually come together. And each of them are so powerful in themselves. So you can imagine what this field is that actually brings them together, where they can dance together, they can engage with each other, they can fertilize each other, they can make love with each other and create the conditions for life to flourish and to regenerate itself. So sensing into climate, the journey's been one of very intricate visions of how climate works, and just inviting everybody here to just open our minds. You know, we've tended so much over the last period of time to be very caught in very reductionist narratives about climate, reducing climate to something which is, you know, a carbon measure. And I think this really reflects our consciousness at the moment, which is so siloed, so reductionist, and so steeped in this narrative of separation and domination. And it's just the very inverse of climate, because we're reducing it to one tiny little measure. And here climate is this vast. If I were to give it one essence, I would say the essence of sacred relationship, because it really is about bringing everything together in sacred relationship, in life-enriching, life-giving relationship. And so the invitation here is very much, as we begin to think about restoring right relationship with climate, how do we extricate ourselves from the current narratives and engage directly with this extraordinary being? It can be through our imagination. It's very personal research. You know, it's not going to the books to do it, not going to the current mainstream narratives, which are very agenda-driven and certainly are not creating the change they claim to want to create. And so that's one aspect of climate I just want to put in the field for now. And just to say that as I've meditated with climate and recognized this climate as this incredible whole system regulatory function, you know, we can sense into that regulatory function on a personal level. What is it that keeps us in balance, in regulating all of these different parts of the whole? And we think about it on the meta level, how climate works from the most microorganisms to the macro processes to beyond, you know, everything, all of this information processing in this incredible dynamic movement, constantly moving and yet constantly in balance. In evolutionary balance, so that it's constantly evolving, and it brings to mind the cycles. It brings to mind the, you know, the way the seasons, and we can also sense into the different climate zones and just be in awe of how these different climate zones are so unique and work together so efficiently, and how every animal and species and being in each of these climate zones have a unique design and are able to manage those conditions, and why they're perfectly situated there as important parts of this information processor. And when we start to tamper with this, when, you know, climate is so based and built on the integrity of all parts of the whole. And we've interfered with that integrity, on the integrity of the rivers, on the integrity of the biodiversity in the different areas, on the migration routes. You start to think about how each piece of the whole is orchestrated. We start to look at relationships. We start to look at the whole. And my sense is that we can't really engage with climate from our rational perspective, because it's not a rational, it's a multidimensional, holistic, holographic being that we need to access those aspects of ourselves. You know, that holistic way of understanding, that holographic way of understanding, that intuitive way that brings all our senses together in engaging with climate. And so I would say that my blessing and my prayer and my intention in bringing climate into this understanding that it is a foundation of life, the fact that it is a relational code. I wrote an article at one point on the code, the climate code of consciousness, because you look at it as a code that informs every part of our being. It's not something inside of us or outside of us, it's both, and it's everywhere. And one more piece to put into the puzzle, and then I'm going to hand it over, is when we sense earth, water, fire, air, some cultures have called this, have recognized this as mental, emotional, physical, spiritual aspects of our being. And so that place where they are all come together and they are the sum of the parts is a foundation of life. Life would not exist without climate. And it is that part that is more than the sum of, the whole that is more than the sum of the parts. So when we contemplate on what do we need from climate, how is climate an intimate part of our everyday life? What is the relationship between human climate, what is the climate of an organization, the climate of a culture, what is the balance? We can start to use this metaphor as well, recognizing that it's not coincidental. And to say, well, the climate, what do we need from climate? And we recognize that it is the foundational code of life in its radiant harmony in diversity, in its evolution. And what does climate need from us? I think is the question that we can ask ourselves today. So those are some of the contemplations that I invite us into. And just for a moment, I'd love to invite us into a moment of reflection on and honoring climate, and just invite climate to present herself here with us and to be part of this conversation, part of this information, and to sense into, as we close our eyes for a moment and honor climate, and just be present with the question, how do we restore right relationship with you? And sense into the response. It can be sensations, it can be insight, it can be imagination, whatever comes just as a beginning start of this restoring right relationship. Thank you.
Beautiful, Shelley. Thank you. Thank you for that opening context of the climate and its as a being. Very interesting. Daniel, we'd be very keen to hear your thoughts on this. How do we restore a right relationship to climate? What would you say?
Well, I'm going to say something completely else now, having listened to Shelley. But I should say, for me, what Shelley just spoke to is one way of framing how climate speaks to the relational pattern, the dynamics of all these four elements coming together into one transforming dynamic that actually becomes conscious of the role of mind in how we bring forth this world. So how even separating water, fire, air, and earth is the beginning of a separation where climate is the pattern that reconnects or pattern that connects. And so for me, ultimately, the question of how do we go into right relationship with climate is like saying, how do we go into right relationship with the sum total of all relationships there are? And that's ultimately a question of appropriate participation, because we're part of that web of relationships. It's how do we go back into right relationships? That's at the core of how do we create regenerative cultures? How do we realign with life's own creative, regenerative, and transmutational elements or patterns that are core to evolution? So for me, what's happening all over the world right now is a waking up to that understanding climate just as the global problem to solve is not the way to approach this. Climate is the feedback. The problem is our way of participating in life and our mistaken understanding of us as other, as nature, or us as somehow more entitled than the rest of the community of life. And what we're beginning to learn right now is that when to go back into right relationships is to take our role that is ancient in us, that is what we have been along most of our evolutionary journey, which is custodians of the ecosystems that brought us forth. How do we come back to that place in a world with 8 billion people after 5 or 8,000 years of this power over story spreading around the world that has created the non-right relationships? And how do we bring in the knowledge of the people who never left being in right relationships and endured 500 years of colonialism and still managed to be the custodian of the biodiversity hotspots on the planet? And so it's this ancient, like my friend Helena Norberg Hodge calls it, ancient future of reconnecting into our species life, like inheritance of being regenerative cultures everywhere, of being healers of ecosystems. And I'm sure Isabel is going to talk about the water cycle, that the water cycle and water is a much more powerful entry point into the conversation around how to rebalance right relationship than carbon is. Although carbon is also useful, but not if it's seen as a problem, because we need to recarbonize our soils very rapidly. So, but water is that transmutational element. It's the most flowing of the elements, and it somehow aids in, to my mind, the reconnecting to our connection. Because, like, even world unity, how do we? The third question: how do we unite humanity to take this forward? Well, fundamentally, it's in our minds and nowhere else. We are fundamentally united. We're not. We're cells in a larger body. It's like saying, how do we unite our livers with our hearts? They are united even if we want to mentally separate them. So I think a lot of restoring climate is not putting climate out there, but putting climate in here. It's our deep relationship to how do we belong? How do we actually bring each other forth by the way we participate in this larger story as human beings, as social communities, or as something as large as humanity? And I think the power there for me in terms of speaking to the pathway is coming home to the specifics of place. Start with a watershed and work on that. Which is the watershed that I have been an expression of for most of my life, or chose to dwell in for most of my life? And how do I participate appropriately in right relationship, healing the relationship within the human community, within the wider community of life, and with the local ecosystem? And it's in that local and regional healing that we actually begin to heal the planet. And it's also in that reconnecting to life itself, indigenous to life, that we suddenly realize humanity and the world has always been united, but not united as some kind of ecological civilization monoliths dictated by a great AI, but united by the great EI, the environmental, the natural, NI, natural intelligence. It's in the relationships of this transforming whole that we are a part of that the wisdom and the knowledge is stored. And so even the kind of talk about nature-based solutions is othering nature again. All solutions come out of this sum total, the story so far that we are right in the middle of. And so, yeah, I leave it at that so we can have some more questions at the end.
Brilliant, Daniel. Thank you so much for building beautifully upon the foundation of life and Shelley had offered, and then your expansion of that and understanding of that. And this is a good time, Isabel, to bring you in And again, building upon that, and how do we restore right relationship with this foundation of life that is climate, Isabel?
Well, first, I love what Shelley and Daniel just shared, and I just want to echo and amen all of that. And the piece that I want to highlight within that is the role of water. I love how Shelley was sharing that really climate is this interrelationship between all of the elements. And if we look at many indigenous teachings and some alchemical teachings, they say that water was actually the first element to be born from the ether, that there was nothingness and then there was water, and then from water all of the other elements came into being, and water actually contains and interacts with all of the other elements in a way that none of the other elements do. It's the only element that takes the form of all of the other elements, takes the form of earth when it's ice, takes the form of water when it's gas, takes the form of fire when it's boiling, and also when it's in its plasma phase where it gets really, really hot. There's water actually inside of the sun that is on fire, and yet it's still water. And also water contains all of these elements in the sense that it contains earth when it has minerals, it contains air when it's well aerated, it contains the fire element because of the way that it interacts with sun and energy. And so this dynamic way that water sort of orchestrates all of these elements to interplay in ecosystems, I think is what makes it the most powerful entry point, as Daniel was saying, into how we can, as humans, how we can affect the climate most effectively and quickest. So I want to kind of change the flavor a little bit real quick for my 8 minutes. I made a few slides to share, if that's okay. So I'll just share my screen. Okay. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes? Okay. Let's see. Go to presenter. Can you guys see the whole screen or just the audience window? There you go. I haven't done a Zoom in a little while. Okay, there we go. Can you see what you're supposed to see?
Yep. Water
Okay.
can reverse climate change is what was there before. Yeah, there it is.
Yes, water can reverse climate change. All right. So if we solve the hydrological crisis, we will solve the climate crisis, period. That's why we have to start taking water more seriously, because in a climate change of increased CO2, really only water has the potential of either increasing or decreasing global warming, because water is the primary vehicle that actually redistributes the sun's energy around the planet. Water is a transducer of that energy and a conveyor of that energy. And all solar energy is actually made available for the planet's ecosystems through the phase changes of water. It's water's phase changes that conducts solar energy into ecosystems. And when there is not enough water to perform these phase changes, that's when solar energy starts to stagnate and starts to warm the planet. Because water is really the only molecule that's able to affect the planet's climate on short timescales. So if we value life, and water is life, then we have to begin to place water's needs above our own needs so that she can do her dharma, so that she can perform her role, which is to keep all of life on earth in balance. And I think this is where the relational side of things comes into play, that it really is this reciprocity of honoring and respecting and understanding her needs as the body of life. So carbon only mediates less than 5% of the total energy transfer in the atmosphere, whereas over 90% of energy is actually governed by the Earth's hydrology. For every gram of water that a plant sweats or transpires, it reduces atmospheric heat by 600 calories. And for every gram of carbon that a plant draws down, that means its soil can retain an extra 8 grams of water. So water cycles can actually be restored much faster than soil sequestration alone, as the only strategy would be able to reduce atmospheric carbon levels. So drawing down atmospheric carbon is really important, but it could actually take centuries, even if we reached zero carbon emissions right now. So this is, I really think, is the linchpin of the climate conversation. If the more we deplete groundwater, the more CO2 will rise. The more we replenish groundwater, the more CO2 will fall. So again, it could take hundreds of years for us to move excess carbon out of the ocean and the atmosphere and back into the soil. So if we're only thinking about addressing greenhouse gas emissions, it's not an effective strategy. Only restoration of the hydrological cycle can restore life. As water is life, water is the planet's thermostat, basically. And water can cool the biosphere and heal destructive climate feedback loops. You know, what happens on a hot day? If you get too hot, nothing feels better than drinking a cold glass of water. We all know that water is cooling. That's common sense. It's human nature, and we have to start putting that into play. As Dr. James Perkinson has said, climate change is not, first of all, a problem to be solved, but it's a communication to be heard. And it's especially a communication of water, because from global scale phase changes to fluctuating sea surface temperatures to cloud microphysics and atmospheric regulation, water is the intermediary between the sun and the planet's ecology. And so when we disrupt the water cycles, the temperatures rise, and we can see a direct correlation from the time in the 1970s when water first began to be privatized. And when water is privatized, when it's commodified, when it's controlled, when it becomes a source of profit rather than the source of life, she starts to disappear. She starts to evaporate. It becomes an abusive relationship. And of course, anyone should leave an abusive relationship, right? Taking from one watershed to give to another, draining groundwater with no replenishment, the virtual water trade, water diversion and relocation, these all disregard water's capacity and the capacity of each unique watershed. So privatizing water is directly implicated in the climate crisis. Ownership of and objectification of water, pipes, pumps, stagnant reservoirs, these are all antithetical to the nature of water, which is a commons shared by the bloodstream of a watershed, as are agricultural farming practices like drip irrigation, which wastes 50 to 90% of the water that goes into the crops. And I think this is where we have to start when we're addressing water, is with agriculture, because 70 to 75% of water worldwide right now is used for agriculture. And as I said, drip irrigation is the most common practice, which wastes 50 to 90% of the water that goes into the system. So if we were to address agricultural water use, that alone would be enough to stop the global water crisis and to really shift climate change. Because, you know, it's not that CO2 will kill us, right? It's the effect that CO2 has on water that is dangerous. So we have to look at, you know, how are we treating water? Where is water most wasted? And really, when CO2 takes its warming effects, it does so through water. You know, sea temperatures rise and sea levels rise, and we see hurricanes and we see droughts. It's really the effects on water. So let's go back to water as the source as well. It's hard to create change by fighting the existing reality. To change something, we have to build a new model. And nature has already built that model. The model is called the hydrological cycle. We don't have to invent something new. We just have to restore the beautiful wisdom that's already in nature to allow water back into her natural habitat, to allow her to move in her natural ways, to give her freedom and sovereignty and autonomy and respect to create life in every ecosystem. Restoring dried wetlands, restoring rivers that have been artificially straightened back to their natural meandering movement patterns. And there are so many beautiful examples of this being put into place all over the world. Restoring key species like the beaver is a big part of it. Just that alone, that kind of hydro restoration, can actually pull gigatons of carbon out of the atmosphere and return greenhouse gases to pre-industrial levels in a matter of just a couple of decades or less, according to climatologist Walter Genet. I think this is really important because, again, addressing carbon alone could take hundreds of years. Starting to address water primarily could take a couple of decades or less. We are not at the point of no return that a lot of people like to say that we are, at least in my estimation, because water is a miracle worker and she really holds the solutions. And so do Indigenous people. We have to start looking to Indigenous solutions around water, because around the world, Indigenous people have managed watersheds brilliantly. Like in Rajasthan, for example, it's a hot and arid desert. They get very little rainfall, but they have an abundance of water because they've come up with a system that conserves every single raindrop. Maud Barlow, one of my favorite water activists, says that scarcity is not nature given. Scarcity is a product of a culture's relationship to water. So if we're creating conditions of scarcity, we have to look primarily at our relationship with water. Cultures that waste water or destroy the water cycle create scarcity even under conditions of abundance. But if we learn to honor every drop, we can create abundance out of scarcity. So again, coming back to this relationship, it starts with the relationship. How do we see water? How do we relate to her? As a commodity or a commons? As a resource or as the source? By objectifying and commodifying water, we create conditions of scarcity, drought, disease, and even war. There's so much interesting research overlaying maps of drought on top of maps of localized conflict. And there's almost a 1-to-1 ratio. Water is not just life, water is also peace. As World Bank Vice President, a former World Bank Vice President said, if the wars of the 20th century were fought over oil, in the 21st century they will be fought over water. So when water is exploited as a source of capital, those who can afford to buy water have the right to live, and those who can't afford it have the right to die of thirst and waterborne diseases. And that's what we see right now. 80% of disease worldwide is caused by unclean drinking water. 80%. So when we address water, all of climate, including our internal climate, our internal health, is healed as well. And this is super addressable because they estimate it would only take about $15 billion to solve the world water crisis. I mean, the annual profit of the bottled water industry is about $100 billion annually. It would only take $15 billion to solve the world water crisis, but that won't happen as long as she's privatized, because in that case, the more scarce she is, the more profit people make. So if her scarcity equates to profit, then we're never going to have a world of abundant water. As Victor Schauberger said, the biggest environmental disaster is our failing to understand the need to protect the quality of water. And I'm at 10 minutes, so I'm going to skip the last part, but just in conclusion, the foundation of all culture is the knowledge and understanding of water. And I would just add to that, it's really the relationship to water, the knowledge, understanding, and reverence and communion for water, because when we keep her from her needs, from her natural life cycle, that's an abusive relationship, and she leaves. She disappears in the face of abuse, as anyone should. So the cure is not in more market-based innovations. The solution is relational. It's listening, honoring, and caring for water.
Wow, Isabel, that was an amazing, profound presentation, and just as equally challenging as it is optimistic with what you're saying about that, how simple. I'd love to dig a little deeper into the $15 billion solution if we have time, but thank you for that. That was really, really brilliant. And I think for a lot of people, showing the intricate relationship between water, the profound relationship between water and climate. And Daniel had pointed Isabel, at you that you were going to do that, and you did that very, very powerfully. So thank you for that. So let's carry that forward, Shelley, in terms of, the next question that we had proposed is, why is this important? I guess it seems like an obvious one in many ways, but what's at stake here if we don't manage to navigate back to right relationship to climate? And after this extraordinary presentation, from Isabel, but what's at stake? Why is this important, Shelley?
Oh, it's important because it is life, and everything is at stake at the moment. Everything is at stake, and we're at a bifurcation point, and climate is our collective teacher. Because like water, and I think water and climate are so grateful always for Isabel's work, and really, this connects deeply to the world water law as well, recognizing that water is the primary medicine of our time to heal climate and to heal all else. And at this particular moment, as climate challenges us as to the limits of our consciousness at this point, recognizing that we can't solve this from within our current colonialist mindset, as Daniel pointed out. We need, the solutions can only come from a more whole system approach. And when we look at, that choice point we're at the moment, it means that we need to radically and immediately change our collective narrative, because the solutions that we choose will come from our narrative. So the narrative needs to be one of a more holistic understanding that both Isabel and Daniel so beautifully articulate.
Beautiful. Thank you, Shelley. There is a wonderful comment in the chat I want to read out from Zambling Cho Tab Ken, who says, "We are the climate. We can change the climate. The climate of today reflects our state of collective consciousness. Global warming is the mirror image of our inner warming." Thank you for that. Daniel, I want to give you the freedom really to take this where you want to take it in the time that we have left. Having heard these profound insights from all of you up until now, what is it that you think is essential for us to reflect on as we move forward together?
Well, I would love to pick up on Shelley's mentioning of how we all need to constantly invite ourselves to stretch our capacity for dynamic process participation, conscious process participation. And that includes it's sort of, I'm sitting in this strange position right now. On the one hand, yes, water is our doorway into this flowing, dynamic, transmutational way of thinking. And anything that gets presented too much as this is the path and forget about carbon or can also become separating again. So I want to call us to this kind of attention that, for example, as Isabel was speaking, I was reminded of something that I just recently read around the link that if current warming trends continue, we're most likely going beyond 500 parts per million, and the absorption of the oceans of carbon and that linking to ocean acidity and the drop in ocean acidity ultimately can get us to a point where all marine life that is based on carbonate structure dissolves. And that would be a push to this global dynamic system that brought us forth that we would probably find hard to survive as humanity. And so on one hand, this is a reminder the carbon cycle and the water cycle are of course linked, and all those cycles are just images that help us understand the dynamics, but they're always more connected than we can possibly speak about in the language we have. And so, but how do we live with this potential cataclysmic runaway feedback loop in climate change? And the not knowing, the very fact that no scientific data can fully 100% prove that it is too late, nor can you find scientific data to prove that it's not too late. And that reminds us that we need to rescue ourselves out of this one-dimensional way of knowing, which is thinking and analytics and big data only, to the multidimensional way of knowing that we are capable of and have always used. Jung spoke to the 4 dimensions of thinking, feeling, intuiting, and sensing. And the feeling, sensing, and intuiting are ultimately participatory ways of knowing the system because we are it, and of understanding that all our climate change internally, emotionally, spiritually, is also a reflection of the climate out there. So it's not all our personal drama, it's also our personal story living the drama of the world. And it's for me, it's that coming back home to place in this not knowing whether we will make it is a pathway to either go out with dignity and deep learning in the generations that are still to come, or to make it through the eye of the needle. So in both cases, for me, the path is in re-inhabitation, in coming home to place, in becoming place again, in fitting back into life's regenerative pattern. I would love to hear what Isabel has to say about that. I loved your presentation. You packed a lot in.
And I
Beautiful.
love what you just shared. I love really zooming out and taking this more holistic perspective of, we can't just keep coming at it from this logical left brain way that's very linear, because I feel like a lot of what has gotten us mired into this mess has been the very left brain, linear, colonized sort of imperial ways of conquer and this and that's what we try to do, and we try to wrap everything into numbers, and we try to say this is the answer, or this is the solution, or this is the data, and I think there's so much room within nature for the miraculous and the mysterious and the unquantifiable, and we can really tap into those. I mean, that's really my estimation, it's the origin of magic, right? There's a quote by Lauren Isley that says, if there's magic on this planet, it's contained in water. And certainly water is this infinite mystery, and the ways that she enlivens everything open so much room for evolution in ways that we can't currently estimate. So at least personally, I know that our state of consciousness influences our own experience of reality. And I think that's probably even more true on a collective scale, that the more we can cultivate hope and faith and wonder and curiosity, the more we actually invite the miraculous, the evolutionary, the more we invite delightful surprise to emerge from the climate, from the trajectory that we're on, and from the solutions that innovators are laying at the feet of nature. If we say, oh, we have this amazing fungus that can eat all of the plastic, here, we lay this as an offering at the feet of nature, and let's see what happens. Or here we have this incredible algae that can help to clean the ocean and help to balance the carbon levels at the ocean. Let's lay this as an offering at the feet of the ocean and see what happens, rather than coming in and saying, we as humans have the answers, and so we're going to do this thing and it's going to have this effect. And I think that nonlinear approach is beautiful and is natural. And I also just want to echo what you said about the global climate mirroring our personal climate. And I really feel that we as bodies of water are watersheds nested within watersheds. Each of our cells is 70% water. Our bodies are 70% water. The earth is 70% water. Our solar system, 70% of condensed matter in the outer solar system is 70% water. 70% of the universe in general is hydrogen, which in Latin literally translates to hydro, water, and gen, creator. Like, we are in these layered nests of watersheds, and it's so holographic in nature because we are mirrors of the earth. We can find every hydrological cycle that we find in the earth. We find the same hydrology mirrored in the movement patterns of water within our own bodies. And just as climate change is happening, this warming is happening, the levels of inflammation on the earth, the levels of personal drought, unintentional chronic dehydration are skyrocketing. People are inflamed. They're literally too hot. People are so dry. They're chronically thirsty. This is where a lot of my work mostly is, which is in the health and biological aspect of things. But I do believe that as we address one, we heal the other, and vice versa.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Isabel, for that, and Daniel and Shelley. And, this theme of our gathering in World Unity Week this year is coming home together. And there's so much about what you're speaking about is kind of pointing in that direction. One of the questions, I guess, just to go around and close on is, what does success look like here? I'd love to know, Isabel. I'm going to start with you here. If you had $15 billion, what would you do? And there's a question from Jan Golding in the chat, which is similar. If you have the unlimited resource, knowledge, and experience, and everything, what does it look like? What does the solution look like if we have the resources, or when we get the resources?
Well, if I had $15 billion, I would pour a lot of it into supporting the World Water Law, I gotta say. And also, I forget if it was you or Daniel who said earlier that we have to come back home to our watersheds. I think it was Daniel who said we have to come back home to our watersheds. And so much of it is in that personal relationship with our own watershed, that we are a drop of the watershed that we live in. We feel so disconnected in the world at large, and this globalization that's happening. But I feel that when we really learn to steward and be disciples of our watershed, that is where the shift takes place, because then we're not importing virtual water from everywhere else. We're not diverting and depleting water to other places. When we learn to live within the limits of our own watershed, balance is naturally restored to the hydrological cycle. So that would be my solution. And the $15 billion, just as a side note, comes from a number that was quoted by Maud Barlow in one of her books. I think it was Blue Gold or Blue Future. So she might have laid out a more specific, budget for that. But I think that would be my general solution.
I think, and regardless of what the number is, I think having a pathway forward, even if it's just seeding a pathway forward, is very, very powerful. And even if there are more questions still than there are answers, having some sense that we are moving towards, through the eye of the needle, Daniel, as you spoke about, rather than, kind of giving up gracefully. I think while we have an opportunity to move towards the eye of the needle, whatever that may look like. So, Shelley, what does it look like for you? You talk about uniting humanity to bring this forward, and perhaps nothing less than that will suffice. What do you see as the next steps in this vision?
I think that one of the most important pieces, I think that we've all addressed somewhat, is this shift in consciousness, reclaiming the narratives from, climate is being objectified at this point and commodified at this point. There's a lot of industry that is working with this so-called greenwashing solutions. It's just, and there is a commodification of it. There's a lot of noise around it. And so I would invest a lot in really supporting voices like Isabel's and Daniel's and others and the indigenous peoples to be heard, and this re-enchantment around climate, so that we can develop personal relationship with climate. And when we start to revere life, water, earth, fire, air, climate, biodiversity, and the web of life, we will change it. So how do we create learning processes which are not of the old model, and really this direct and holistic reverential relationship with life, and invest an enormous amount in that? And of course, the World Water Law would be a very strong part of that. I'm so grateful to Isabel for really, to me, water is a very accessible pathway to understanding and being with the interconnectedness of all of life. As I dream into water, as I listen to water, it takes me into the interconnected, the field of interconnectedness. It's not a standalone.
Beautiful. Thank you, Shelley. Re-enchantment. That's a beautiful word as we come to the end here, Daniel. We've done 4 other plenary panels on restoring right relationship with earth and fire and water and air and fire. And now climate, and all of them ultimately have indicated this sense of a reverential respect, a re-entering into a respectful relationship with the sacred. So I think this re-enchantment, Shelley, is very important. So Daniel, brother, final words are for you today. What does what's our best hope, and how can we collectively steer in that direction?
Just to sort of stick with the pattern, although it's a bit focused on the financial side, but where would I suggest to invest $15 billion into a solution pathway? And maybe that's precisely it, into inviting people not to get too obsessed with solutioneering our way out of this, and actually resource people to deeply investigate how they can build local food, water, energy, and education sovereignty, and basic fiber sovereignty, the core self-reliance needs at a regional scale, in ways that would actually heal the local ecosystem. So incentivize processes of bringing territorial agents, NGOs in different fields. Like, for example, here on Mallorca, we're working on bringing the NGOs that look at protection and regeneration of the Balearic Sea, together with those that talk about regenerative agriculture and restoring the land or protecting certain areas of the land, and work on integrating all of this into a process of bioregional healing. So for me, the thing to resource is people in place manifesting their potential to be healers of place. And in that process, heal themselves, heal their watersheds, heal their forests, heal their soils, heal their bioregional and local economies, but not as preppers against the doom and gloom of a dire future, but as people doing their bit, united in a humanity that is doing their bit in their places. So this is not a cutting oneself off the planet, and that's why things like the water law is so important, because we need these overarching, how do we reintegrate into life's regenerative patterns, systemic understanding of the living body of Gaia, that pulses with water in its veins, to say it poetically, and how do we fit back into this? And it's actually that there are really practical strategies. Invest the money into bringing local NGOs together, into focusing local governments on local plans, into deconstructing the international trade laws that make it actually currently illegal to build vibrant local economies that could weather the uncertainty of what's definitely coming at us in the next 3-4 decades. So I think, and just to pick up on that important word of reverence and take it to a slightly less practical, or actually more practical, but slightly less strategic. I'm digging even deeper for myself here. I want to pick up on reverence and enchantment. Ultimately, because when you do this hard work of actually doing this locally at a bioregional scale, and you suddenly, there is no other, because everybody is in the bioregion, and the people who are completely not aligned with these ideas are also there. And the invitation to meet them as part of the climate, as manifestations of that larger relational totality that you're trying to heal, and work with them and let yourself be worked through that and transformed by that. That becomes a conscious process, participation process. And that's where I think the magic will come out of these other realms that are currently scientifically not analyzable, to rally with us so we manage to heal our places before it is too late.
Amazing. What an incredible panel. Thank you so much for being with us. I think Jan Golding has summarized it quite beautifully here in the chat, Daniel, Isabel, and Shelley. He says, incentivizing, educating, promoting transdisciplinary collaboration for bioregional healing sounds like a brilliant solution. So that's a nice summary of it. I really want to thank you, Isabel Friend, for being with us, Shelley Ostroff, and Daniel Christian Wahl. Thank you for this really enlivening, significant contribution to World Unity Week as we come together today, which is just beginning, day 6, and honor the climate. Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us.